In the last video, I hope that we answered a bit about what neurons are, okay, as the basic building blocks of perception and of the nervous system. In this video, we'll talk a bit about how neurons perform one of their major functions, which is to transmit information. We won't look too much at transduction and processing just yet, but for now let's just get an idea of transmission, because this will teach us a few more things about neurons. One number that will stick in your mind forever on from this moment is -70. Why is -70 so important? Well, -70 is a unit, it's a voltage. We're talking about -70 millivolts. -70 millivolts is well, it's important. We'll see why in a second. This plays a role in the production of signals in neurons that can then be transmitted to each other, and that signal is called an action potential. And we'll get an idea about how an action potential arises in a neuron, and then we'll look at the synapses between neurons to see how those neurons pass information onto each other. So what's -70 millivolts? Well, to do that, we should back up a little bit and get a bit of an idea about something called ions, and we're right down to the atomic scale now. An ion, if you've done if you know anything about atoms, you know that they have a core, a lot of protons in the middle, and these are positively charged, and then they have negatively charged electrons around the outside. And that number is normally equal, such that the overall charge, there's just as much positive as negative, and the atom is kind of balanced out, it's neutral overall. But if we add some electrons or remove some electrons, then we tip the balance and we begin to get a net positive or a net negative charge on that ion. And we would write an ion, if we've got a sodium ion, as we'll see we have many, and it had lost an electron. Electrons are negative, so losing an electron would make it less negative, that is more positive. We'd write a plus there if it's lost one electron, or if we had two, it would be Na is sodium, and a 2 plus for having an overall 2 positive charge. So these are ions, and the important thing to note is that in your body there are lots and lots of ions, and outside of the cells we have a kind of makeup of ions that there's a lot of sodium ions outside, and inside the cell there's less sodium and more potassium ions, and there's other ions too, but these are the key ions that play a role in this. And the difference is that the outside of the cell, then, if we measure the outside of the cell and set the outside of the cell as, we'll say that's our neutral voltage, whatever that is, that's neutral. And then if we compare it to the inside, so we could have a voltmeter outside of the cell, and then we put it inside the cell, and we find out that compared to the outside, the inside is -70 millivolts. And this doesn't just go for neurons, this goes for all types of different cells. But for neurons, it's -70 millivolts, and this is called the membrane potential. This is the membrane potential, and this is because it's the membrane of the cell that keeps the sodium out and the potassium in, and allows this difference to be maintained. In fact, this can't be done easily. A lot of work has to be done by the cell to kind of force these ions in and out of the cell and to keep this balance, and about 40% of the energy from the food that you eat goes into maintaining this balance in the neurons. This -70 millivolts is also called the resting potential, because it's the potential that we have when the neuron is quiet, let's say, when there is no activity, when the neuron isn't stimulated, when it's not firing an action potential or something like that. But we'll see that the communication between neurons and the action potential rests on the movement, the fluctuation of this potential from -70 either up or down. Either it could become more positive and perhaps become -65, or it could become more negative and perhaps go down to -75, or more or less, depending. And what we want to understand is how that occurs. So we said that the difference is maintained because there are a lot of ions outside, specifically sodium ions all around outside. A lot of these positively charged, these are positive pluses outside of the neuron. A lot of potassium inside. K is for potassium. Now, in the cell membrane, if we draw kind of if I just draw two layers here, we could say this is our cell membrane. This is inside the cell, and this is outside the cell. Then there are actually some channels, and these are not surprisingly called ion channels, and these are like pores that allow ions to flow through in certain circumstances. There are pores that allow ions to flow through just to maintain this difference, but there are also some that allow ions to flow through due to other conditions. So when one neuron communicates with another, it kind of, and we'll get to that when we look at synapses in a minute. Needless to say, these gates open, allow ions to flow in, allow a lot of these positive sodium ions to suddenly rush into the cell, meaning this area next to the channel suddenly gains a lot of positive charge. This positive charge could trigger more channels further down. As those positive charges go into the cell and spread out a bit, they trigger more channels to open, and that allows more charge to flow in. And this all happens very, very quickly, by the way. It quickly returns to normal. But as this happens in the dendrites, typically in the dendrites or in various layers around areas around the membrane, these tiny voltage changes in each of these can propagate along the dendrites and kind of meet up, and they add together in a process called summation, I think I mentioned in the last video, where they add together, and if they build up to enough, a lot of positive charges going in, and perhaps in one region it's just a little bit, and in another region it's a little bit, but as they add together, if we reach this, if it becomes positive enough that it reaches negative 55 millivolts, that is our threshold. And once it reaches that triggers the opening of lots of these gates, and a lot of positive charge flows in, and all of a sudden it shoots up to about positive 20 millivolts. That's about a 90 millivolt change all of a sudden, and that can then travel the axon in the same way that we said before. There would be gates at points along the axon that allow more sodium flowing, allowing that signal to seem as though it's kind of propagating down the length of the axon. And that is our action potential. When it reaches that threshold, it allows a sudden burst of that positive ions to flow in and travel the length of the axon. Before that point, they're kind of confined to the cell body, the dendrites, and so on. But once that threshold is reached, that impulse suddenly fires, an action potential fires, and it travels the length of the axon. And it's important to talk about this fact that we're talking about the movements of atoms at this point. And it's difficult. The more into the neurons we go, the less or the more absent consciousness and perception seem to be. So we'll have to come out of this and begin talking about networks of neurons at some point and begin trying to find this kind of phantom in the system. But for now, we're just talking about the atoms. So this is in a single neuron. We're talking about the changes of ion concentrations in the neuron. Ions are allowed to flow across the membrane and change the concentration. We can actually see an action potential measured on a graph here. This would be the resting potential. So at this point, we would have the sodium on the outside and the potassium on the inside. Perhaps some kind of stimulus has been applied here, and sodium begins leaking into the cell, begins flowing through these ion channels, and so the cell begins to become slightly more positive. This dotted line would be the firing threshold, our negative 55, and at that point lots and lots of gates open, and all of a sudden we have this massive influx of positive charge, bringing the potential, the membrane potential of the cell up to 20 millivolts. That is quickly accompanied, that we've not talked yet about the fact that it returns very quickly. Those sodium ion channels close once it reaches this positive 20-ish, and all of a sudden the potassium begins to flow back in, and we have this it's called repolarization. It begins to move back towards the resting potential of negative 70, and then it's ready to fire again. So that's one cell inside of one cell. How does that cell transmit to another cell then? Well, that's where the synapse comes in. If we zoom in, here's another neuron. If we zoom in, we have the dendrites at one end. This perhaps a potential has built up and triggered an action potential that has travelled down the axon then and reached the end of this neuron at the axon terminals. If we zoom in on this area, we notice we have other neurons ready after this neuron connects to other neurons, but they don't quite touch, and that's where the synapse comes into play. We have a synapse. If we zoom in on that area, we see that the tip of one neuron and then the beginning of the next neuron is met by this tiny gap in between. And if you've ever wondered what a synapse is the gap. Synapse is the gap between the two neurons. And if I draw a kind of my own close-up of this, this is the inside of the first neuron, and then this is perhaps the dendrite of the second neuron, and this is the synapse, the gap between the two. Now, the electrical signal can't cross the gap, so they have to have some other way, and there are electrical synapses that we won't worry about too much. They're mostly used in invertebrates, but for us, we use chemical synapses, and we see these tiny dots on the image up here. These are tiny pockets called vesicles that contain things called neurotransmitters, and they allow neurons to transmit their message to other neurons, not surprisingly. And neurotransmitters are things like serotonin, you've perhaps heard of, or dopamine. These are examples of neurotransmitters. When an action potential travels down one neuron, the axon would be up this way, and it would travel the axon, eventually make its way to this axon terminal, the end of this neuron, and it would push these vesicles out of the cell membrane, then out into the space outside, and all of those serotonin or dopamine molecules would be kind of loose in the synapse. Some of them would attach to certain areas on the next neuron. These are called receptors. And once they've attached to those, they cause a kind of change that opens some of those pores that we were talking about, allowing positive charge to flow in. So that's how a synapse can allow one neuron to enable another neuron to fire an action potential. The action potential causes these chemicals to be released, and they can then cause changes in the membrane of the next neuron that allows positive charge to flow in, and that can give rise to an action potential in that neuron. And the whole process goes action potential, synapse, action potential, synapse, and this cycle allows the one signal to be transmitted through an entire chain of different neurons. So I hope that this gives a little bit of an idea about what the action potential is, that it's this change in the concentration of positive charge inside and outside of the neurons. In the next video, we'll look a bit more at the action potential and begin perhaps to build on an idea of how neurons can come together in circuits and how we can read action potentials.